Good morning. My name is Damon Siegel, one of the co-founders of the Academy of Chief Marketers and the custodians of Superbrands and Cool Brands UK. I'd like to welcome you all this morning to our brand network event in partnership with Investors in People and Innerfit on the very important topic of stress and health in the workplace. In 2020, of all the British adults in employment, it is reported that 79% commonly experience work-related stress. This is 20% higher than 2018's findings. And statistics show that a staggering 70 million workdays are lost each year due to the mental health problems in the UK. This costs employers approximately £2.4 billion a year. Over the next hour, we'll hear and be able to ask questions from our expert panel, and I'm delighted to welcome to the stage Paul Devoy, the CEO of Investors in People, Chris Pinner, founder of Innerfit, and Beth Sampson, People and OD Lead from Investors in People. Please enjoy, and I'm sure we will learn how to reduce these statistics. So over to you, Beth. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And first off, a big thank you to the Academy of Chief Marketers for their support in making this webinar happen today. So today we're going to talk about the three areas of well-being: physical, social, and psychological, and how they relate to stress management. All three areas have key lessons for us to learn from when it comes to stress. But before we dive into kind of further questions, I just wanted to open up to the audience. If you wanted to share in the chat, how are you feeling today on this slightly grey for me morning? So thanks again for taking time out to join us. What we'll do is we'll go through a couple of questions, and our panelists, Paul and Chris, will share their advice and tips on those areas. Apologies if you were hoping to see Anne-Marie this morning. Unfortunately, she couldn't join us, but I'm sure we'll make up for it with lots of other kind of stories and tips. So please do engage with the chat, submit any questions that you have in the Q&A section, and we'll answer as many as we can later on. The more the better. We do like a bit of interaction on these webinars. So I'll dive straight in with the first question, and I'll head this one towards you, Chris. So our bodies have evolved to develop a fight or flight response when put into a stressful situation. But not every stressful situation is something dangerous. It could be a task or a meeting at work, even a webinar, and yet our body can't tell the difference. So could you tell us a bit more about the correlation between nutrition and stress, Chris, and your best advice for how we can manage both effectively?
Yeah, of course, Beth, will do. And I noted a couple of comments in the chat already, and I think the first one or two were about being busy and a bit zoomed out. So I think hats off to everyone for joining and making the space and time for this. I'll kick off by just probably reminding us a little about stress before we delve into more detail. It might be stuff that we've already heard, but in my mind, stress is very much a physical response to either a physical or psychological cause. So what do I mean by that? Physical response, if we think about how we feel when we're stressed, and maybe guys put in the chat like words that come to mind right now. How do you feel when you're feeling stressed? For me, it might be that my heart rate's increasing a little bit. It might be that my hands get a little bit sweaty, my oxygen, like my lung breathing rate increases, etc. And ultimately, these are physical symptoms, right? And they could have been caused by either psychological or physical things. So if we're being chased by a bear, that's amazing because our body's going into that fight or flight mode and we can escape. But if we're being chased by our boss on a deadline, for example, that's a psychological cause. And actually, that's the one that a lot of the time in the work context, we're really dealing with here. So what's actually happening is that our body is deciding that our adrenal glands should release some cortisol. We might have heard that term before, and that's putting us into this high energy state so that we can run away or fight. The challenge with that is that in that high energy mode, the last thing we really need is our digestive system. We don't need our reproductive system because it's not important at that moment in time. But over a long period, if we're chronically stressed or consistently stressed, that can play up and cause problems with our digestive system. It can mean that we want to eat more. It can also mean that our metabolism can reduce because we're trying to conserve energy ready for that fight. And ultimately, longer term, that's going to potentially lead to weight gain. Research has shown that's a factor. And it works both ways as well. I'll just conclude this answer quickly by saying that we've just spoken a little bit there about the impact of stress on diet and how we might want to crave high sugar foods, for example. But actually, it works the other way around too. So if our diet isn't good, we're probably more likely to be going to feel stressed. So if we grab for that caffeine to get us through the day, that's going to boost our cortisol levels and we're going to feel more stressed. So both directions. I'll stop there because I know we've got a long session ahead and we can cover plenty more.
Thanks, Chris. That's really helpful. And it's interesting. I was actually talking about this yesterday. I had one of those days where I was eating a lot of cake. And by the end of the day, I'd kind of done that sugar roller coaster thing up and down. And I actually felt much worse, even though in the moment where you kind of reach for that slice, it feels like a reward. It wasn't benefiting me in the long term. And I think another thing that's interesting that occurs to me with stress and nutrition is that it can sometimes be difficult to be aware of our stress levels. It can creep up without us almost noticing. So actually keeping an eye on your diet and your appetite is one of the ways that you can be more self-aware about stress levels, I think. So for me, taking that cake example, if I'm having a day where I find myself reaching for sweet treats a lot, that's a signal to me that maybe something's a bit out of whack and perhaps I need some maybe restorative time.
Yeah, it's a really nice point, actually. I'll pick up and then I'll definitely let Paul talk at some point. But the energy curve is quite nice to think about. Our nutritionist, Christy Coleman, who's amazing, will often ask, okay, what does your energy curve look like? So if everyone just imagines on the x-axis, you've got time, on the y-axis, you've got energy, and you were to just draw a line which represented where your energy was at. It's really interesting to think, okay, are there spikes after I've had my lunch and I've had like a coffee and sugary piece of cake? And then is there a subsequent dip? Because nutrition wise, we're looking to reduce our blood sugar levels to a healthy, safe level. So we can experience that roller coaster as you described it. And then the second piece of that exercise could be to overlay a curve which represents our stress. So out of 10, like how stressed are we feeling? And I'd hazard a guess that there's going to be a correlation between those two curves. So there we go. I'll be quiet now.
Thank you, Chris. It's really interesting. I'll definitely keep that in mind for the next day when I've got a cake tin open. So now I'm going to head to you, Paul. What are some of your top tips for managing stress, and what is your best advice for businesses to support their people's mental health?
Yeah, thanks, Beth. For me, I think it's a complicated area because what works for me, I know won't necessarily work for everyone else. So, for instance, in my own case, the way that I like to manage stress is I exercise regularly. So I try to run 4 miles at least every day, and getting out in the fresh air and getting my heart going, that's the thing that really works well for me. But I was speaking to someone else the other day who said to me, which really struck a chord with me, is the whole pressure about being fit actually, adds stress for someone because it's another burden and another expectation, another feeling of, well, I can't even be fit, and it's another reason for them to feel down on themselves. So I think for me, you need to work out for yourself what works for you and develop realistic goals about how you can improve your own physical, social, and psychological well-being. Not everybody can run a marathon, but maybe you can walk a bit further each day than you did the day before, and put in place little small goals that's going to help the key factors that drive everyone's well-being. So that for me is all taking the time out to really almost do a little diagnostic on ourselves. What are the things that stresses me, and how can I put very small, simple steps in place in order to manage my well-being, whether it be physical, whether it be psychological, or whether it be social, and not put too much stress on yourself that unless you're training to run a marathon, then your physical well-being is nowhere near it should be, because all that does is just make you feel bad about yourself. So I'm not going to tell you that what I'm doing is the right thing, because that works for me, but it's more about understanding what works for you and giving yourself the space and the time to work that out. And then from an employer point of view, I think the first step you've got to do is to really understand what's going on with your workforce and how they're feeling, and do a really important piece of diagnostic on that, and get real data about, well, what are the issues that people are facing? Because unless you really understand that, there's no point in putting in place strategies because you might be doing the wrong thing. So you really need to do that work as an employer to understand the issues that your employees are facing. And one of the things I think is really important is not to just look at it through just the well-being lens, because there's other things that go on inside your organisation that will have an impact on well-being. And the classic example I always use is around about management. You know, you can have, you know, gym memberships and yoga classes free and access to counselling and all of that. That's all great. But unless you've got the fundamentals in place, those other strategies won't have the positive impact that you need. So one of the things I always recommend is you need to make sure that your managers are trained up to look after your people properly. There was research done by the Chartered Management Institute that we've got over 2 million accidental managers in the UK. And that basically means that people have been put into management positions without having been properly trained to do that role. Now, you would never do that with any other function. You wouldn't let someone manage your accounts that hasn't been trained as an accountant. You know, you wouldn't let someone be a nurse who hasn't been trained to be a nurse. But for some reason, we think it's okay to put people into management roles without having trained them properly. And line managers are responsible for the well-being of their team. And it's not an easy job to manage people. It's a really challenging and complex job. But in the UK, we don't seem to invest enough in that. And all the research shows that there's a direct correlation between people being well managed and their overall well-being. One GP told me that 80% of the people that came to his surgery presenting a mental health issue was work-related, and the vast majority of them were down to poor relationships with a line manager. Now, I'm not saying managers are bad people. They're not. They're trying to do the best that they can, but we need to enable them to be successful and good managers by providing them with the advice, support and training in order that they can then look after their employees. So that would be one thing that I would strongly recommend. Sorry, two things that I would strongly recommend as a foundation. Doing a proper diagnostic to understand what the issues are, and then making sure that your managers are properly trained to support your people. Because without that, any gym membership or well-being strategy is going to be like throwing, you know, seed on dry ground. It's just not going to grow, and you're not going to get the value out of it that you potentially could otherwise have.
Thanks, Paul. Some great advice there. And I've just seen a question come through on the chat from Dominique. Is there any kind of specific training that you would recommend for line managers in this area? What sort of topics should it cover?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I think is important for line managers to understand is the whole area around about emotional intelligence and some basic coaching tools and techniques. So if you've got both of those two things in place, understanding emotional intelligence, how, you know, getting people in the right space, but also coaching people, not necessarily providing them with the answers, but having some basic coaching skills that you can ask the right questions, and that in itself can help your colleague to, you know, come up with the right strategies that they need to put in place to move forward. I think if we can help more managers be coaches, then I think that will significantly not only their performance but their ability to support their teams.
Yeah, I'll probably pick up that thread as well and echo what Paul said on there being different levels of it. So I think the first level is it's easy to think that everything needs fixing with like a wellbeing plan or workshop or one-to-one or whatever that looks like. But actually, if your management style is one of just dishing out workload, all of the rest of it is just not going to work. It's just a non-starter. And I think that the CIPD had some interesting stats around work-related stress. And I think the top two reasons that people gave were heavy workload as number one. 60% of people were citing that as a factor. And then management style was about 40%, I believe. And if you think about the top two there, both completely under the control of management. But the challenge, as Paul hinted at, is that you're being squeezed from every angle under pressure as a manager. And I think it's about having the skills, knowledge and attitude to actually do the job, but also the time and space. Because if you're not looking after yourself and you've got workload coming down to you, it's very difficult to have that honest, empathetic conversation. So I think to loop back to Dominique's question, the first layer would be normal leadership training. How do you plan workload? How do you onboard a new member of the team effectively? All of that normal conventional stuff. And then if you have that in place, you can start to think about well-being training. So at the moment, we did a session yesterday for a retail marketing company focused on opening up the conversation and literally just allowing the time to talk as colleagues at a similar level about the challenges their teammates are going to face in the coming year. And then the question, what is your role as a leader when it comes to health and well-being? And I think that's a really powerful one because, as Paul hinted at as well, as leaders, we can be tempted into giving answers because we think our job is to see the future and then create it. But actually, it's far more powerful. You get a lot more involvement, a lot more commitment if you have involvement. And I think it's about asking the question. So Dominic, it'd be interesting to hear what your team are actually looking for, and then empowering managers to ask their teams exactly the same question. It might be around mental health. It might be that mental health first aid is a really good avenue to go down. It might be more about raising the awareness level. It might be something completely different. But I think that would just be a couple of thoughts that come to mind for me on that over the last few days. Absolute pleasure.
Just on your point about management as well, one of the things that Beth has done great in our organisation is create forums for managers to come together and talk about the challenges that they're facing, and they almost kind of become a peer support group where they coach and support each other. That doesn't cost anything, but actually, you know, if it can be well facilitated, and we're lucky we've got someone like Beth, but if that can be someone even just trained to facilitate that discussion, it helps managers share, you know, challenges they're facing with colleagues in a similar environment with similar experiences, and we found that that's been a really helpful approach that you can use.
Absolutely. And I think going back to Chris's point about sort of almost being able to pinpoint where the pain areas are or where the needs are, those kind of forums can be a really good place to just listen to the themes and the topics that are coming up. And then as a kind of people lead or HR lead myself, it then gives me insight into what I can provide in terms of proactive support for next time before it gets to the point where it's raised as an issue in one of those forums. So that's maybe something to think about as well. I can see we're having a flurry of questions through the chat. So I'm gonna touch on one that's come through about how you actually ask your employees about mental health if you've got maybe a kind of dispersed workforce in places without computers or that are out and about on the road. Any thoughts on that one, Paul?
Yeah, certainly with the approaches that we use, it can be done on mobile phones. So you can actually send surveys, etc., to someone that they can complete on their mobile phone. So not having access to a computer doesn't need to be a barrier, as long as you've got, you know, your phone numbers or personal email address to employees, which most companies have these days. Then you can you know, get the feedback from just sending something to their mobile phone and ask them to fill it in. And what we find is that people, particularly on these subjects, people are really keen to let you know, as long as they feel that it's independent and confidential, then, you know, you will get good response rates. Certainly with the surveys that we put out, we get really high response rates, and that gives you a good grounding for the data, and that you can have confidence that you're moving forward on solid data.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to know how many people you've got as well, Sarah, simply because that's the scale point quite important there. But I think similar to Paul, you want to make sure that safety is there so people can trust where they're sending the information. That kind of links to the manager's point. Like if you're a manager who's built that trust, built that empathy and built a relationship, then you almost don't have to proactively go out to search for the information. You can trust that you'll attract it because people feel comfortable sharing, was one thought that came to mind. And then the other was that we had a conversation recently with one of the police forces, like regions of police force, and it was a similar challenge in that they wanted a way to reach people out on the beat, essentially, and that's really difficult if they're responding to emergencies quite frequently, and work-life balance is a tough thing. So it was almost getting creative, like process of elimination, what communication channels actually exist. And then if you really whittle it down, you're kind of looking at the phone in a lot of cases as well. So it depends on what's possible, but maybe worth having a A3 piece of paper and a bit of a brainstorm.
Yeah, good idea.
Brilliant. And I'll circle back to your question, Tasha, in a sec, but I've just seen one come through off the back of this kind of point we're exploring here from Joanne. Can we suggest a good wellbeing survey to use?
Well, obviously, I would suggest ours. But you know, if the other alternatives are you can create your own questions and use SurveyMonkey or something like that. You know, and then you can get the feedback through that way. So, you know, we would be delighted to help anybody that wants to look at something like that. But equally, I know, Beth, there's different tools out there, isn't there, that you can just use to, if you want to do something really quick and simple, you can use some of the free software that allows you to do staff surveys.
Absolutely. And I think it depends what your goals are as well. Because our survey is brilliant to kind of do almost a step back appraisal of your kind of wellbeing strategy and how the different pieces fit together and the impact that that's making, the kind of next steps to go forward. But if you're trying to address perhaps a specific problem that's been highlighted in the business, maybe around stress or something kind of more niche, then it can be helpful to design your own question set using something like, like Claire said, like forms, Microsoft Forms. So I'm going to circle back to Natasha's question because I think this is a really interesting one. So how do you deal with resistant line managers to try and get them on board? Any advice?
Yeah, I mean,
Question.
you go first, Chris.
Oh, I was going to let you and buy myself some
I'm
time.
happy to go first. I think the thing is just to engage line managers, because being a line manager is a tough job. People are wonderful creatures, but they're also really complex creatures. And being a line manager is challenging. And if you can present it in a way that this is going to help make their life easier, because it's going to help them understand what's going on for their team and how they can get the best out of their team by helping each individual within it bring the best version of themselves to work every day. So if you can frame it in a way that this is actually going to make your life easier because you're going to have a more motivated, committed team. And then once you've got that commitment, you can then show them the steps towards that goal. If you try to force it on them as an imposition, without them understanding the benefits for them, then you'll ultimately meet resistance. But it's about showing how it's going to make their life easier, which it ultimately does. Anyone who's managed a team that's dysfunctional and not working well and highly stressed, knows how much stress that puts on the manager. But if they're working with a team who are engaged and motivated and feel like they're being looked after, then that's a very different experience. So making that case to someone and helping them understand the benefits for them, I would say 95% of people would get on board with that.
Yeah, and I'll pick up, and it'd be interesting to know why they're resistant, if you've got insight into that, Natasha, because I think Paul's point is spot on around like understanding their situation to start with, and almost like the same as we'd ask a line manager to do and listen to their teammate more than they talk at them. Probably worth taking a similar approach here in terms of understanding that resistance, because they might just have loads of work on and this wellbeing feels like an extra thing to do. But until we understand the reason why there's resistance, it's difficult to unravel it. And then we're really talking about like resistant managers who might have had bad experience with wellbeing interventions previously. Then it's almost saying, okay, let's pick our battles a little bit here. And if you're just getting started, thinking about maybe a pilot and getting a small cohort and maybe a group of managers to go through something which gets clear results, and almost just say, look, this is why it's worthwhile, because it's proven, basically. And I think that some managers will definitely be more open to stories of success, and other ones will want to see statistics. But it's about thinking back from what that manager would want to see and then working something through on that basis, because we've done similar stuff for employee related sessions. We were working with a communications company, and the basic breakdown of the audience was into three. The first was engaged, interested, they're already taking part in stuff. The second group was not engaged but interested, like could be involved if they were given the right stuff in the right way. And then the third group was not engaged, disinterested, frankly. And the idea was to focus on that second group, using the first ones to encourage this one's up to there. And then ultimately, like if you're in that third group, you're probably going to look and think, okay, I might want to start getting involved in that. So it's amazing how the herd mentality could probably kick in there.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Paul. I completely agree with that. I think sometimes, Natasha, it can feel a bit like you're kind of shouting into the void sometimes. But what I'd say from my perspective is that sometimes these, these kind of behavior changes or mindset changes around wellbeing and mental health don't happen quickly. It might be you have a conversation this week and you see some changes happen in a few months, but everything that you do will make a difference. So kind of keep the faith. I'm going to share with everyone on the call, actually, before we went live, when we're in the kind of like host panel waiting room, we were all feeling a bit jittery and nervous. And one of the things that we did do was some quick wrist exercises to sort of release some of that tension. So that leads me to my next question for you, Chris, about kind of the relationship between movement and stress. What advice can you give us around that?
Nice, Beth, thanks. And folks, I can't see anyone at the moment, but if you want to do this, feel free. I normally deliver standing up because it allows me a little bit more wiggle room and it's just relaxing. So I'm hoping that Paul and I weren't on our own there by doing that weird wrist thing. But the basic reason that well, a few reasons scientifically, like we've already covered a little bit that stress can be a physical response, but in terms of the reverse relationship and movement and mental fitness, I like to use that phrasing as opposed to mental health sometimes, because that movement piece really can boost our creativity. It can boost our cognitive performance in general. It can improve our memory long term. Actually, I listened to something recently which said movement is the single thing which can really retain your IQ over time, because the brain is being fed with more oxygen if you consistently exercise like Paul is doing. So there's a few things going on. I'll list off 3 or 4. One is that movement does increase that blood flow, as mentioned. 2 is that endorphins and dopamine are released. So endorphins, you might have heard of, they're kind of the happy hormone, if we want to call it that. Dopamine is more to do with your reward mechanism, we call it that. So when you get a dopamine hit from looking at your WhatsApp messages, for example, your brain's thinking, cool, this is awesome, let's repeat that behavior. And then another one to throw into the mix would be brain-derived neurotrophic factor. So BDNF is essentially, in my mind, a posh way of saying just hitting a bit of a reset button. So if you've done a bit of exercise, you're going to feel more relaxed afterwards, you know. And then GABA, gamma-aminobutyric acid. Research has shown that people that do yoga are really high in GABA, and that's associated with feeling calm and relaxed and all of that kind of stuff. So I think definitely movement can combat stress. It's worth thinking about bedtime, like pre-bedtime routine. If you're going to do a high intensity interval session at 9 or 10 p.m, it's worth thinking about your body, and if getting your heart rate up that high is going to impact your sleep. But yeah, the research again shows that it works both ways. If you move well, you're more likely to sleep well, feel less stressed. And if you sleep well, you're more likely to move well the next day. So there's quite a lot there.
Thanks, Chris. So just picking up another question that's come through on the chat. Do either of you have any experience using buddy systems at work to help people sort of check in and make sure colleagues are okay? How have you found that?
Good question.
Yeah, well, we have kind of a buddy system as part of our induction, don't we, Beth? And we buddy people up with someone, just because I think the way you induct people into an organisation is a key factor in how they perform longer term. So we have that as part of our induction. I know Gallup have always had this measure in their employee engagement survey about, do you have a friend at work? And that's always been that you've got someone to go to talk, that you feel like you can trust. And having watched 2 documentaries this week, I don't know if anyone watched Roman Kemp's documentary about suicide, his friend committing suicide. It was really well done. It was very sensitively done. And just having someone that is actually looking out for you at work, that comes and checks to say, are you okay? And his tip, so the main tip at the end of the program was to ask somebody if they're okay twice. Because if you say, are you okay? People just go, yeah, I am, but are you okay really? And that second question is the bit that actually gets somebody to open up, because then they need to say if they're really okay. So I think having some sort of buddy arrangement where you've got somebody that's looking out for you at work, and you're looking out for other people, and you're just asking them, checking in with them, how are they doing, and how are they doing really, and asking that supplementary question to really get them to open up if there's anything that they're struggling with or feeling challenged on. I think something simple like that costs no money can actually have a huge impact.
Yeah, and I've seen a few things as well, companies getting quite creative on that in terms of linking people up based on postcode. for a socially distanced walk, or even just coffee meetups with random people from the company. So this is from business, which is potentially hundreds of thousands of people actually globally, and they just put people in a room that they've never met before. They may well never meet again, depending on whether or not they get on. But the point being, like, you're just seeing someone different, you know. And then on the point on buddy system, it kind of got me thinking again about the mental health first aid piece, but also more broadly wellbeing ambassadors and champions and reps and whatever name we want to call them. But essentially having a group that is clearly, like, to everyone in the company, like, available to talk and support and share feedback with and get tips from and be signposted to resources, etc. And I think if you can raise awareness that there's kind of a group of buddies available, that can be a really powerful thing, particularly if it's aligned to a proper program which has consistency and is like coherent through the year, because people know it's not a one-stop, it's not a quick fix type thing. And that then starts to get to the cultural point, which I think Damon had a question on in the chat. But there's a lot there. There's a lot to think about, definitely. So again, it always comes back to the company and the people within it.
Yeah, I completely agree, Chris. And one of the things that I've noticed over the last year is that you probably have those people that are kind of naturally buddies already in your organization. And it might just be a case of giving them a bit of recognition and permission to kind of almost expand that role and recognize the value that it brings. And then making sure that they're equipped with the right tools and resources and support to kind of build out from there. So it might not be a case of kind of designing a buddy system from top down. It's just elevating what you have already that's already in place. So yes, I think that segues nicely into another question in the chat, which is around how you can kind of build an internal brand around mental health and embed it into your culture. Any thoughts on that one?
I'm happy going first as well, because I've let Paul do that tricky job a few times now. I maybe won't get all three, but you can fill in the gaps, Paul. The first thing that came to mind for me was on the senior leadership piece. Talking of company recently, they had 2 people leave, specifically citing work-life balance as one of the driving forces behind them leaving the business. And I think that people are intelligent, right? Like, people can see that if a leader says something but does something different, there's just that disconnect there. And that role modeling piece that everyone talks about as being so important very rarely gets done well, frankly. So I think that the number one point for me would be about getting that senior leadership buy-in. It's about having those people role model good behaviors. It's about having them give an email out, all at, saying, guys, I'm attending this session. It's going to be absolutely awesome. Folks, this is our EAP provider. This is the support they provide. I'd be interested, actually, like, assuming everyone's on here for business reasons, or at least partly, like, how many of us on this call know whether or not our company has an employee assistance program? And then of those people, how many of you would be able to describe the services and offer that they're able to provide? That's a really, really interesting one, because in my experience, it's very few. And senior leadership in particular should know about this stuff, because I think it always comes from the top. We can talk as much as we like about communication upwards and starting grassroots, etc. But that top piece is a prerequisite to having any success when it comes to creating a culture of well-being.
I think I agree with all of that. I think one thing that's really powerful is stories. So if a senior leader can open up about, and be vulnerable, and that's something that Brené Brown talks a lot about, as vulnerability has been a key tool of a really great leader. Because if you can show that you're vulnerable as well, and that you've had experiences and talk about those experiences that link to that, pushing that agenda forward, then it's much more authentic than just a policy or a strategy, because there's a story with meaning attached to it that shows there's an intent behind it, that you genuinely believe in it because of your own experience. And I think then your employees feel safer to open up if they see someone at the top of the organization taking the chance to be vulnerable in that way, and then they feel less frightened about being vulnerable. And that opens up the debate, and then gets it to be a conversation in the organization, with then more likely to engage with it in a meaningful way because they feel it's authentic.
Yeah. PwC is a good company to look at. I mean, the videos are quite old, I think, but I think there's a This Is Me campaign linked to a Mayor of London campaign. And just a bit of inspiration if you're literally thinking about creating some videos for that. I just posted a link in the chat, which I was going to post because we're talking about relationships, and there's a talk in there about a study from a Harvard study into relationships. But then, Paul, you mentioned Brené Brown, and we've also got her TED talk there, because absolutely awesome. If you've not come across her before, well worth a look.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. And just to kind of add my penny's worth as well, it can also be helpful to look at the kind of structures and processes that you have in place generally around your people. Because sometimes if you kind of dive back through perhaps like a dusty HR handbook and look at it with the kind of mental health wellbeing lens, some of the things that we do in terms of process almost automatically aren't the best things for people's mental health. And it can be that those are the things that are applied at almost the moments of truth when people need support, something's going on for them. So, I mean, it's difficult to kind of go from the drawing board and change your perspective like that. One of the things that I did was work with our internal group of wellbeing champions and got them to look at the handbook and the policies and tell me what they thought could be adjusted or corrected, obviously within the bounds of employment law and, you know, good guidance. But that was something that helped us kind of put mental health and wellbeing really in the center of how we work as well as all the other good points that Paul and Chris have covered there. I'm going to move on. We've got another great question, and this is actually, I guess, quite a big one. So let's see how we get on. How do you think working from home is affecting stress levels? Obviously, it's kind of disrupted some of our normal routines. And then with that in mind, how do you think we can manage stress if there's a transition back to normal life? Where should we start?
It's a good one. I'll kick off with a few stats. I had a bit of time to dig out something I already had on my desktop whilst Paul was answering the last one. So a few stats here just to set us going. From Aviva in August 2020, it found that 13% of employees felt complete happiness. 44% of people never fully switch off from work. 43% are troubled with how much work interferes with personal life. And 55 and 58% respectively of people say they're neglecting their mental health because of work, and they're neglecting their physical health because of work. So I think that's the most recent stat I've got at the moment. I acknowledge that that's about 6 months old, but anecdotally, everything that's just been reeled off there has been backed up by what I've seen at companies. Sleep has been a big thing, which is obviously related to stress. I've had probably over 5 conversations in the last few weeks about burnout and what it looks like to build up to burnout, because as most of us on this call probably know, there are signs and symptoms to look out for before it happens. So if a few people have experienced burnout, you can guarantee that there's going to be a lot more feeling stressed and anxious that, if we don't get it right, could reach that point. So if you were to do your mental health first aid training, you'd experience a framework about the stress container, and how if workflow and stresses keep funneling into this container, unless we're able to open the tap and relieve some of that stress, that's essentially where we end up is burnout. And I think that the point about lacking boundaries between work and home and lack of interaction, absolutely spot on. I think we did a talk in April 2020 titled Movement, Structure and Boundaries. And I could say that probably in April of this year coming, we're doing one about motivation, structure and boundaries, because literally it's really hard to nail that piece on setting the work-life balance where you want it to be. So I think it's a long way of saying, I think working from home stress is difficult to see because we don't see people in real life, but I think that it has probably made things worse. And there's not many people that have come up with like concrete answers on the boundaries and the commute and the work-life balance. I don't know what you guys would think, Beth and Paul.
Yeah, I mean, my experience is different to that. I'm part of a network of CEOs, and we've been sharing our staff surveys on the extent to which people want to come back to being in the work 5 days, 3 days, 2 days. And there's a consistent theme across all the surveys that I've seen, is that the majority of people don't want to come back to work 5 days a week. They want to work from home. The vast majority, at least 3, work from home 3 days a week. So there is benefits in not having long commutes, expensive commutes. But I do recognise that over the last 12 months, it's not been a real environment. When I say real, what I mean is it's not been a normal environment. I've been homeschooling. My wife works in a school, so she's been going into work every day, and I've been homeschooling teenagers. And I can absolutely vouch, given that they're not in the room with me, that has been pretty stressful and challenging. And I think anyone who's been trying to homeschool, my heart goes out to you. It's really, really, really tough. So I think the last 12 months, it's difficult to draw any substantive conclusions from that, because there have been so many other factors in play. But I think it's highly unlikely that we'll go back to what we did before. I think people have seen that, we're doing, whereas 12 months ago, we would have been doing this at a conference, we're now doing this over Zoom, and it's become quite normalized, and it's been done for long enough for a lot of that to stick. So I think a lot of what's happened over the last 12 months will take flexible working that was increasing, it's accelerated it in 10 months by 10 years. And I think a lot of that will stick. How much of it will stick, I don't think anybody actually really knows. So just at the moment, Beth and I are having lots of discussions about what the future is of Investors in People in terms of how our operating model will be. We haven't taken this to our board meeting yet, because that's next Thursday. But certainly the direction that our thinking's moving in is that we need a year to see how things are going to pan out. So once the restrictions go, let's test out which of the things that seem to be from the staff survey they want to continue. But then let's look at it over the next year and see whether they actually do stick or not. And then towards 10-12 months from now, we'll then have a pattern of data that tells us what direction it's really going in a more normalized, assuming we don't get any more lockdowns. But assuming we don't get any more lockdowns, we'll get a picture of what the pattern is like with the restrictions being in place, and then make longer decisions on the back of that, rather than making snap judgments. Because Chris, I'm not disputing your data, I'm sure it's all absolutely true. I'm seeing different data. So I think we need to take a bit more time to actually understand what it looks like once we have a degree of normality, and then take a view maybe in 10-12 months time.
Yeah, I think you probably got a bigger data set at Investors in People, so I think that's absolutely fine. And actually one that I did come across in a conversation recently was about 90% of the team saying that they wouldn't want to go back to working in the office like before, and they wanted to stick roughly to what they were doing. So I think definite positives from some conversations too. What about yourself, Beth?
Yeah, I'm just kind of thinking from a practical perspective. One of the things that I'm working on with our kind of internal ambassador group, we call them People Heroes, is our Investors in People roadmap for supporting us all through this kind of second transition phase. I remember doing a session on the kind of emotional change curve when we had the last lockdown. I think I'll probably dust that off and get it out there again, because it's another big change for us all. And some of the things that we've been talking about are very simple, maybe offering a couple of hours for people to go and get haircuts when that releases. So you're kind of building in some flexibility and recognizing the disruption that might be happening in people's whole life rather than just at work. Another thing that occurred to me sort of while you were talking is that I think people are kind of conflating working from home with flexible working, and actually working from home is one form of flexible working. And if you just substitute working from the office with working from home, that isn't necessarily going to result in a reduction in stress or better mental health, because what you actually need is more flexibility, potentially generally, having the ability to stretch your lunch break to do some stretching, or starting earlier or later, that kind of thing. So it can be helpful to look at it in the round. And the last point that I'll make kind of touches on Josie's point. If you're dealing with a workforce that's experienced the last year quite differently, some frontline, some in offices, I guess that is something to consider, is how you kind of bring groups that have had these vastly different experiences back together, and managing the potential different viewpoints, like you say, resentment. I'm sure we've all heard the phrase that we're in the same storm in different boats, but just imagining bringing a cruise ship and a little sailing boat into one river, there are some challenges there. So that's kind of my viewpoint on that. So I'm aware we're coming up to the last 15 minutes. So if you've got any last questions, throw them at us and we'll get through them. But I've seen an interesting one come through about whether the advice differs for different generations. Do you think that that does make a difference?
This is a hobby horse of mine. Can I go first?
Yeah, sure, Paul.
Yeah. So I'll be 53 this year. Yeah. My mum had mental health problems. My dad was an alcoholic. I went for therapy in my late 20s for about 4 years because of that. But I never told anybody about it because there was a stigma attached with mental health back then. So I don't feel and also purpose motivates me, and all the research says that Generation Z and Generation X are motivated by purpose more than previous generations. I don't think that's true either. I think it was about what we were allowed to ask for back then, rather than whether our intrinsic motivation was any different from the generations that are coming forward now. I think people are opening up more to what it is that they want and need. And interestingly, I've seen I used it in a presentation about a year ago, and I've seen some other people use it as well. Maslow's hierarchy of needs was done in like the 1950s. It's coming back into the zeitgeist again, because what it talks about is our intrinsic motivations as human beings. And the things that shaped me as a person was not because I was born in 1968. It was much more to do with the environment in which I was brought up in. So I think the whole generation stuff is lazy thinking, and it's an easy way of categorizing things and making policies on the basis of dates. Frankly, I think it's a lot of nonsense. And if you understand what the intrinsic issues are of human beings, which we all are, which we all share, no matter what our age is, then you deal with that. And just because you're 53, and I think I'm on the cusp of being a baby boomer, I think I might just miss that. Doesn't mean to say that I'm necessarily not got the same issues or concerns as someone who's younger. I think it's a big mistake organisations make to categorise in that way and make assumptions on that basis, because in my experience, it's just completely wrong. So anyway, I'll get off my horse.
That's good. I love it when like panelists like don't always agree and actually like share proper opinions. And that's definitely one. I think I'm a Gen Y. I think I'm a millennial, and I'll share like two thoughts that came to mind for me. One is purpose, a big one. I was talking yesterday about Drive, the book by Daniel. I think it's really, really cool. Yeah, awesome book. The link I put in the chat has actually got that on there, and it's about 3 drivers. Like the surprising truth behind motivation is autonomy, mastery, and purpose. So autonomy, are you empowered to kind of do your own thing? Mastery, can you get really good at it? And then purpose, obviously, clues in the name. And I think that's an interesting one, because I think that's common across generations. The second thought that came to mind was a conversation I had yesterday with a fashion company about targeting or supporting their retail team who've been going in to the office far more than anyone else, because they've kind of needed to. And they've essentially been feeling the pressure, feeling a little bit forgotten, because everyone is obviously talking about working remotely, and they're not working remotely. They're being asked to, in some people's eyes, probably risk their lives to turn up and do things. So the idea that they'd come up with is about how do we connect with these people? It needs to be funky, it needs to be a bit different. And they came up with the idea of Dr. Alex from Love Island was the person that was mentioned in the conversation, because he's done a lot around mental health, I'm told. So I think
he's a mental health ambassador now, been appointed by the government.
There you go. Yeah,
I think he's got an official title and an official role, and I have to confess, maybe I am arrogant against my own. I've never watched Love Island, so I've never heard of it until he got that official title.
Yeah, but I think ideally you can do both, right? I guess try and, on the more serious level, tap into that purpose piece, and then have a bit of fun with it as well, and learn from doing.
Fab. Thanks both. And I guess to round off the session, we've talked a lot about kind of connection and communication. We touched on it with the buddying, but are there any kind of final points around the social wellbeing piece that you'd like to raise in relation to managing stress at work?
Yeah, you go first, Chris.
All right, Paul. Yeah, I think it's that it's so important. The point I mentioned before about relationships being the common thread between what makes a kind of happy life and a less happy life, as per that Harvard study, really important. And picking up on the manager's piece again, the single most important relationship most of us will have at work is with our manager. So I think that the social connection piece, I'll interpret it that way to begin with, and just say that if we're a manager on this call now, like, have a think about building that relationship and think about, how well do I know my teammates? And on the surface, we might think that we know them really well because we get along and etc. But actually, like, are we picking up on non-verbal cues and verbal cues that they're sending out? Have they recently been turning off their screen a lot and just having the camera off rather than on when they used to be quite extrovert behavior? And so I think it's worth thinking about that. And then social connection piece, I'm just looking forward to back to seeing people in real life, to be honest with you. Sorry, Paul, you can back that one up.
Yeah. So I think the social aspect, we've all missed that. Just going out at lunchtime with someone for a chat and the informal conversations. I think that's something that we've all missed, and I certainly know a lot of people that I've worked with in the past, their work and their social life was very intertwined. They maybe necessarily didn't have a lot of friends outside of work, and that's had a big negative impact on them. So that social aspect is important. In fact, one of my colleagues said to me the other day that actually they think that the days that people will choose to come into the office will be linked to when they've got some sort of social engagement with their colleagues at the end of the working day, and that will prompt them to come in. But it's going to be absolutely fascinating to see how our behaviours after a year in this strange world that we've been in, what behaviours are like once we get out the other side of it, and how much of things that we're doing now will stick, and how much of it will go back to our blended ways of what was there before. I think it's going to be fascinating to see how that unravels. And I'm not sure, I'm skeptical about anyone who says that they know what the answer to that is, because I think there's so many complex things at play. It's really hard to know how we'll all react when we get our freedom. I think there'll be an element where we'll all go a bit crazy when we get some, because certainly in Scotland, Nicola has got us under very tight control. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in Scotland when the pubs open again. That will be very interesting.
Good.
Thanks, guys. So we're coming up to the last 7 minutes. We've just had 2 questions come through. If we can kind of get some quick fire answers to these. So the first one's from Sarah, and it's basically, what do you do when someone just doesn't want to open up? They don't want to share their private life, and actually they respond in quite a hostile way to that sort of questioning.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, you can only offer a hand out of support and use the right questioning techniques to give someone every opportunity to open up. But there comes to a point where that person has to help themselves and come towards you at some extent. But that's why I think some of the coaching and questioning techniques that Chris and I have talked about is asking the right question in the right way. 9 times out of 10, most people will open up if it's the right question asked in the right way with the right intent. Most people will open up for that. But if you've done that and they still won't, I think for me is you just need to keep an eye on them and make sure that you're tracking their behaviour, and not just give up if they don't respond well the first time. Just stick alongside them and make sure that you're watching out for them, because there could be something else going on, and they might need somebody's support at some point when they're eventually ready to open up.
Yeah, the point I'd add would be on potentially putting in place a wellbeing action plan. So some people just don't want to talk as much, and it's come up recently as well in group workshops about the balance between being intrusive and being personal and getting to know people. And I think that as long as you are looking out for whether or not they're in danger, to think worst case scenario, like wellbeing action plan, asking questions in a more formal meeting that says, can I look out for any particular signs and symptoms that you might experience if you're going through a period of poor mental health? Are there any scenarios at work which can trigger stress or poor well-being for you, if you know what to look out for, and the reality might be that none of those things are the fact that they're quiet and don't want to talk about their personal life. It's absolutely fine. It's just about trying to protect them and protect you as well, I think.
Yeah, and I think on that last point, sometimes, I mean, I'm certainly guilty of it. I make problems that don't need to be my problem. And it won't always be the case that someone will want to open up to you as an individual for all sorts of different reasons. But maybe if you've got someone that you think needs an avenue, perhaps consider what network is around them and make sure that, if it's not you, maybe it's their manager or it's a colleague or it's someone they're working with on their project, or even just trying to create a platform to communicate on any basis, like even GIFs, that can sometimes keep the door open to chats later. The next question we've had come through is about managing anxiety for those who've been working from home and are returning to the office. Any quick tips or signposting on that one?
The CIPD have got a good page for returning from furlough. I'll just try and track it and put it in the chat because I'm conscious we haven't got very many minutes left. I'll do that in a sec. That's what I'll say.
Okay. Thanks, Chris. And also do feel free to connect with any of us as panelists. If you want to keep sharing resources or questions afterwards, I'm sure I'd be happy to do so. I'm sure Paul and Chris, I hope I'm not volunteering you up against your will, but
that's fine. Just put that CIPD thing in the chat.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, I'll close off here then. Damon, did you have any finishing remarks?
Yes, thank you. Obviously, just want to say thanks to everybody. I'm sure that you all found some golden nuggets in the insights that everybody just provided. Especially thank you, Beth, for facilitating the panel today. And Paul and Chris, thank you for your fantastic contributions. It's really appreciated. Special thanks to Scott from Investors in People, and Felisa and Charlotte from the team at the Academy of Chief Marketers for organising today's event. And of course, thank you to all of you for joining us today. And obviously, I'm wishing you a very stress-free afternoon ahead. So that's it from me, signing off, and wish you all a good day.